2021, the year where Nickelodeon has suddenly begun to move many of its older behemoth franchises and bringing them into the modern age. From the live-action version of Avatar: The Last Airbender being announced a few years ago and an entirely new studio being opened for the Avatar universe, to a reboot of the classic Are You Afraid of the Dark going strong with the second season. I won't try to write a smooth intro any longer because we all know which revival we're here for. iCarly. For you to better understand where I'm coming from and understand more of what I will have to say about this new installment, I will have to give you a little bit of my own history with Nickelodeon and, more importantly for the purposes of this video, iCarly. Just like many of you, I grew up watching the likes of SpongeBob, Avatar, as well as most of the live-action programming the network offered. On the side, however, YouTube and Twitch, or what was known back then as Justin TV, was getting off the ground, and the idea of watching random people who play games or host a show was still very much a novelty back then. And in this environment, iCarly immediately stood out as it was way ahead of its time. Watching the older episodes, sure, some of the humor is silly and relies on cheap gags, but the premise of the show is pretty much what the internet looks like today. Anyone can gather a group of friends and host an online show, allowing them to tailor it to be the exact type of content they wish to produce. And even back then, this idea was incredibly intriguing for me. Perhaps not surprisingly so, as it's essentially what I'm doing here. In short, I do have a fundamental bias against this show, which, depending on how you look at it, can make this revival an instant success in my eyes, or I could completely disregard it as a cheap ploy at pulling on nostalgia. But now that you know a little more about me, let's get into what this revival gets right and wrong. First and foremost, I want to emphasize that this is not a reboot, it is a revival. While it emulates many points of what the original did, there is a clear emphasis on this being an entirely new story and not just retreading old ground for the sake of the title. To be frank, I think the first episode does an almost perfect job of reintroducing these characters in a subtle, and sometimes not so subtle ways, telling you what they've been up to for all this time. In a way, it almost feels like catching up with old friends with whom you once spent a lot of time with. There are some of those small, old things that have not changed that make you reminisce about the old days, but the overall picture is very different. They are no longer in school, they all have their own personal life problems, they have relationships, etc, etc. Another thing worth bringing up is of course the fact that the entire cast does not reprise their roles, most notably Jeanette McCurdy, who played Sam, and Noah Monk, who played Gibby. While some fans may be outraged and disregard the entire show just for that reason, to me, that seems like another weakness that the show turns into a strength. Though, before I elaborate on that idea, I feel like it's important to mention that unlike most shows where a member leaves the cast, the character is not forgotten. In this case, they don't linger on it for a long time, but Sam was Carly's best friend after all, and so, we do see a brief conversation about where she is now. Again, it's not a major story driving point, but it was very nice to see them acknowledge the elephant in the room and see that the cast is still very much open to having her return. If you're curious as to why they did not choose to reprise their roles, I won't get into this too much here, but it is largely due to a very problematic particular person being involved with the original. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I recommend you look into it. Though it is also worth saying that we still aren't sure which of the other characters from the original we may expect to see throughout the revival. The details surrounding this question have been quite ambiguous. Going off of what we see in the first few episodes with the appearance of their biggest fan Mandy, however, it does appear that they want to at least briefly feature some of the original characters, even if they are recast, as is in the case of Mandy. But back to what I mentioned before, the loss of these characters is offset by new and interesting personalities, those being Millicent, played by Jaden Triplett, and Harper, played by Lacey Mosley. I'm sorry if I butchered those names. Their introductions are interwoven through relationships we already know quite well. Millicent is introduced us through Freddie, and Harper through Carly. And personally, I felt like the dynamic between this group felt extremely natural, and did really make me feel like they have known each other for years. And in a series where there is already a pre-existing thought that this isn't how it once was, that is saying a lot. If you had told me that we would be watching Freddy's kids interacting with Spencer and Carly, I would have called you mad, but it works. And this calls to back what I mentioned before, that these characters, while similar at the core, have changed a lot. For instance, Spencer is still a wacky artist, but he has made it very big, though with some luck. And so some of his personality quirks revolve around the fact that he does have a lot of money to spend. Having gold be in his drinks is a far cry from the once rollerblading Spencer. On the same note, Freddy's stories after the events of the original are also quickly addressed and give you enough of an idea while still retaining some of those crucial questions about exactly what happened. We obviously know he shares custody of a stepdaughter. We know that he's had multiple failed startups, one of which had been initially funded by Spencer, and so on. All of these small details set in stone that feeling that their relationship only grew tighter with time. And while talking about this, I'll have to be honest with myself, I can't really put aside my nostalgia for this one. But just the feeling of seeing all of these characters in the same place, with just as much time passing for them as has for me, was indescribable. And it's at these moments where I will never understand why some people disregard all revivals right from the get-go. Don't get me wrong, some absolutely butchered the franchise that should have been left alone. But not iCarly. It is not afraid of straying away from the established places and events of the original. For example, while it's not something you may outwardly notice right away, the revival never mentions Groovy Smoothie, the catalyst for one of the biggest memes to come out of iCarly. Now, this may age poorly depending on how the series goes, but I think it's entirely possible that the reason why it went from a location we saw almost every episode to not even being brought up is because times change, and what might once have been an important place for the gang is now a distant memory. As for what once made iCarly stand out, the idea of an internet livestream. This is another aspect that I'm very glad the series addressed. One of the initial episodes brings up this very fact. Carly acknowledges that once they had essentially the only web-based show out there, but now everyone is a creator. And this was one of those things that I thought might be kind of jarring for the revival. The cultural context surrounding the show has changed massively, and the whole group of people hosting an online show would simply be boring. But again, the show embraces this. The large cameras and tech is now replaced with a single phone and a few lights. The shows are no longer the main premise, but more of a side detail. And in connection to this, it's worth saying that the subject matter of these episodes very much fits in with the current internet landscape as well. Aside from all the jokes about canceling someone, there is an interesting conversation around capitalizing on a meme and the concept of all publicity being good. As someone who's following a lot of discourse surrounding these sorts of issues online, I found these episodes very enjoyable, which, again, is saying a lot considering that in most cases these sorts of pop culture references often feel like they're crowbarred in just to attract younger viewers. The way the revival approaches this subject matter is done in an adult way of laughing about the absurdity of it while still trying to teach some sort of lesson out of it. As I mentioned before, one of the episodes deals with Carly's decision of whether or not to capitalize on a meme that unintentionally makes fun of Spencer's new art piece. Obviously, some classic iCarly shenanigans ensue, but ultimately, Carly and Spencer make up with a lesson learned. Social media is fine as long as there's not a third party being harmed, in this case that being Spencer. The problem, however, is that the wider public is still angry, even though the whole crux of the argument has been resolved. This is obviously commentary about the over-dramatization of relationships online. People fall out, the internet makes a big deal out of it, yet even when the people involved make up, the community is still picking sides. And to play up the satirical nature of this whole deal even more, Harper doesn't calm the crowd down. Instead, she simply gives them something else to be angry about, and they leave right away. Again, I don't think I need to explain what this is commentating on either. As you may have noticed, I avoided getting into any specifics of the episodes throughout this video. Purposely so, as I want to give you the idea and the impact of this revival, rather than discuss several talking points from the episodes. As the rest of the season, and hopefully more seasons, are released, we'll have plenty of time to delve into particular episodes and discuss their respective stories. But, overall, I was very surprised by how much I enjoyed these few episodes. Nowadays, I'm almost always wary of any kind of reboots or revivals, but I like to give them a chance, and, in this case, it really paid off. The writers respect the audience and understand that we too have grown up. The characters are much more mature while still retaining the comedic aspects that made them great. The stories being told are also relatable to an older audience, and the references to the age of social media also flow very nicely. All in all, it is a very strong opening to what may become a true successor to the original series. Obviously, we'll have to see where they decide to take it with subsequent episodes. Maybe they'll introduce an overarching narrative, maybe they'll stick with the self-contained stories. Only time will tell. But if you take away anything from this video, do give this series a shot. It really is a faithful continuation to the story. And that's the video. As you may be able to tell, this is more of an impromptu one by just how surprised I was about the revival, so I hope you enjoyed some of my very raw thoughts on it. I also wanted to say a really huge thank you for the reception to the latest video. I'm very glad to see you enjoying the One Piece saga as much as I enjoy making it. As usual, if you want to buy me a coffee, the Patreon along with the rest of my socials are below. But other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.